And we're live on YouTube. So thanks again for everybody joining in on the call to another Open RFC call. I've copied and pasted the meeting notes doc in chat. And just as a high level housekeeping and sort of introduction, my name is Darcy Clark. I'm the open source engineering manager here at NPM. And we run these calls bi-weekly, essentially as an opportunity for folks here at NPM to interact with the community, source feedback, and hopefully move conversations and work forward that the community thinks is interesting and that we should be working on. As a quick note, and something that we haven't been doing here, I just want to restate that these calls are under a code of conduct that we expect and hope that all folks abide by. And that's outlined here in the meeting notes doc, as well as on the NPM Open RFCs or the RFCs repo, which is where we source most of the agendas from. So if you haven't checked it out yet, feel free to add yourself to the attendees list. And if there's any notes from folks or anything that we want to shuffle in terms of the agenda, feel free to let me know right now. Otherwise, we can dig in as listed.
The number 2, the publish confirmation prompt, can probably be like shifted to the bottom of the list, and that funding one can probably be moved to the top. The publish one's in a almost done state. There could be more added before it's talked about in these calls.
Okay, that's the publish confirmation prompt number 96 RC.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so move that to the end, and the multiple funding sources you want to hoist.
Yeah, because I think all the work on this is done, so we can chat about it and get it ratified and
awesome
scheduled and such.
Cool. I think for a lot of these, since they are ongoing, and we've actually touched on many of these RFCs in the past, that it's essentially providing probably status updates here on this call. So yeah, let's dive into PR number 68. So multiple funding sources. Jordan unfortunately noted that he can't jump in on this call today, but wanted to see if we can essentially ratify this RFC as the work is already queued up also, and further discussion could be had, I think, in the PR itself against the CLI. So, I mean, how do folks feel about us essentially pulling this in? Good?
I'm good with it, yeah. He said he updated the RFC, so I'm not 100% sure what the final changes were. It looks like there's 3 commits past his comment, which likely we're going to have a roll together. So I'm not exactly sure what the verbiage change. I know he said one of the things specifically was that he was going to add more examples to the RFC. Yep. I think he's done that. So there's 2 examples in there now.
Yeah.
Or 3 even? 4? Oh my goodness. Yeah, there's a few. So yeah, this could probably be ratified.
Isaac, do you have any qualms about this?
No, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. So in that case, I'm going to pull it in. There is some work that we're going to have to backlog to support this change on the website in terms of, is that you, Michael? Your typing is quite loud. If you can mute your...
Sorry, I thought I was muted.
Yeah. So if possible, yeah. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna have to backlog, I think, a bit of work against the website where this information is primarily consumed and used to this point. So if you're taking notes, Michael, can you just make a note of that I'll essentially make sure that there's an issue or something backlogged for that work. Cool. So I will pull this in right now. Awesome. Cool. So moving on, PR number 92, or RFC number 92, or 90 actually. I don't know why it says. Oh no, 92. This is the RFC that Daniel had proposed, and there hasn't really been much update here, although I know, Dominicus, you're on the call. I'm not sure if you had any questions around this or had a chance to look through this RFC now. This is essentially the concept of us introducing a new capability in terms of staged published packages, which I know that you've done a ton of research on for the package maintenance working group. So I'm not sure, again, if you had any comments on this.
Yeah, I did read through it. I think it's fairly clear to me. I did have some questions there. Just wasn't sure whether it's better done as a PR review or waiting for this discussion. But I suppose we can cover those if we have time and interest for that now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to use your time now. Like any feedback that you had, initial feedback you had on that would be great. We can capture it here and then we can sort of follow up as well in the PR.
Yeah. Okay, so the first question I have there is the RFC does talk about a new user permission that allows to grant user the ability to read or promote packages in staging. Nowhere in the RFC does it mention how does 2FA interact with the staging process. I mean, whether it's implied or not, I'm not sure. But I suppose it is implied, but the fact that it doesn't state that explicitly. That I assume there would be no 2FA for staging, because that's the whole point, right? For publishing a stage package, and then there would be 2FA for promoting the package.
Yeah, that's right. I think the implied auth there is that you'd be utilizing a token, an auth token, that, like, the implied workflow there and usage of that staging would be that you would have a read-write token that you could generate for staging, right? So that's what you would use to essentially auth. So yeah, that would like essentially bypass OTP.
Okay, and then the other question I had there is a little bit unclear on the terminology.
Should we make that more clear though? If you were confused by that, then I'm guessing other people.
I do have a pending code review there with my notes, so I will just publish those after the meeting, and then they will be there. Okay, the other question I have there is the spec talks about packages, but when it says package, I'm not sure it means the same thing that I mean when I say package, and I think it refers to tarballs essentially as packages, because it does mention in one place that unresolved questions in bike shedding section, it says multiple stage packages, and it says that there's a limit of a single stage package. I assume you can have, as an author, multiple stage packages, but you can only have a single version in staging.
Yeah, so the understanding there is you can stage a particular version of a package name multiple times, overwriting it in a way that you cannot if it's a published version. But they're still keyed based on the version number. So for example, you don't have 3 different packages at version 1, 3 different like instances of, foo at 1.0.0. Every time you stage a new 1.0.0, it overwrites the previous one.
But is it okay then to stage 1.0.0 and 2.0.0?
Yes.
At the same time, in parallel? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And then Okay, then that explains, I suppose, the follow-on questions. It wasn't clear from the spec exactly, so maybe some clarification needed there. I'll leave a note. Okay, and then this sort of answers the other question that I had there, is how does that interplay with Semver? But essentially, if you have a single version, if you have a 2.0.0, then Semver, if you install with a stage flag, then it installs 2.0.0 if it matches the Semver specifier. Otherwise, it installs some other version, right?
Right. Otherwise, it wouldn't even look in the staged versions part of the packament. Just by way of terminology, packament is the package document that contains all versions and the top level metadata for a given package name. So if you did, npm install foo at 2.x and you added the flag to include staged versions, if there was a 2.0 that was published and a 2.1 that was staged, you would get 2.1 because that would be kind of the best Semver match.
I have a question. Can you publish, or how do I phrase this? I think there, by what I've just heard, there's an implicit restriction in that you cannot have the same Semver in your staged versions section as there are in versions, which is to say you can't have a 2.0.0 in versions that's published and a 2.0.0 that's also staged. Is that correct?
That is correct. So when you stage, the restriction on what's in staged versions is it cannot be something that has been previously published, right? You can't like stage a version of 2.0 if there's already a published version of 2.0.
Right. And then when promoting, you would basically, so I'm trying to just imagine what the packament metadata looks like, right? You'd have a staged versions hash or whatever, and a key on versions. And when you promote one, you'd basically remove it from there and add it to the versions list, right? Because it's no longer a staged version, it's now a version, right?
Right. It gets removed from the stage versions object and put on the versions object. And then it also gets its time field updated.
Right.
Because now it's actually been published at a particular time. What that does is when it's if it's ever unpublished, that version number still can never be used again.
If a staged package is unpublished, is that what you meant? Sorry, or a regular?
If a package is published, whether that's directly published or promoted from staging, and then is unpublished, you still can't reuse that version number.
It's the same way as a public, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Wes, you're about to say something?
Yeah, so for the metadata around publish and promote, I think we need to make sure we get the user for both steps, right? Because they're going to be different in a lot of cases. And I think knowing who built it and who promoted it is important as two separate metadata points. That's
a really good point. And I think, I don't think that's in the spec already. So
yeah, I don't think it is either.
You need to capture that, right? Right now, we just have the, underscore npm user is the one who published it. So we're going to have to kind of figure out what happens to that field. Should that be like the, I would suggest that underscore npm user is still the person who published it originally, like who created the package. And then we add a new field for who promoted it.
I agree. I think that who built it is ultimately really important, right?
Right.
Because if a user promotes it without necessarily inspecting the contents, who's on the hook there? We need to make sure we know both parts, right?
Right. And if you do want to go through and figure out, let's say a developer's machine is owned, and you want to go through and find, everything that they published is now suspect. The npm user is the field to look at.
That's a good note.
Just kind of maintain that consistency.
Yeah. Cool. Was there anything else to make us as you were going through that? I know, again, like going back to the fact that I think you've.
Yeah, sure. I think from my perspective, the rest is sort of clear. It sounds like a very reasonable and a very reasonable start of what could grow further.
I think that was cheers of this is a good idea from the little one.
Agreed. That was a ship it.
Ship it. Okay. Awesome.
So part of the just to call this out, I'm sure it's clear to everybody on the call, but part of the complexity of actually delivering this is what Dominicus called out, the sort of ironing out the details around auth tokens and access control and what we require 2FA for, what we don't require 2FA for, and potentially even having a different set of users who are allowed to promote versus who are allowed to publish. That is definitely going to require some kind of subtlety on the server side, which I think is not called out in this RFC, because typically the RFC's repo is sort of RFCs for the client, right? From the client's point of view, like if you tell me to publish this to staging, I will try to do that, and the server will allow it or not. And if you tell me to try to promote it, I will try to promote it, and the server will allow it or not. And the server will either prompt me for 2FA or not. But I feel like getting this actually delivered, even if we implement this in the CLI, but it's not supported on the registry, like it doesn't actually do anybody a bit of good, even though it's obviously a big part of the project and worth doing. I think we can, for the purpose of implementation on the CLI, like we can leave a lot of that stuff ambiguous, but it does need to get sort of prioritized with the registry team.
So
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Wes.
Okay, so I agree that ultimately a lot of that stuff needs to be there. I would rather see you ship the basic thing so that we can start working with it and then get the details ironed out later with the auth. So like if I can have all users who have publish have promote for now, fine, right? Like that's significantly better than where we're at.
Right.
And so like ship it. That said, I do think in the long run, the granularity will be important. So that's my 2 cents. I just don't want you to feel like you need to ship something perfect to make
no.
us all satisfied.
That's never a concern of mine, getting things perfect. But the two big issues there are just the difference in the ACL and the difference in the 2FA requirements, and the sort of minimum viable server-side support is that the Corgi docs have to include the staged versions as well as the published versions, and we sort of have to be able to have all the basic logic of like what happens when it goes into staging, like what's the endpoint to promote it, like all of that stuff does have to get worked out. The ACL is probably going to be trickier just because that's a very deep rat's nest, and probably the 2FA as well will be a little bit challenging because of just how it's implemented right now.
Yeah, where the tar also lives is a bit, that's going to change, right? Like, so it's going to have to, there has to
It'll
be
likely
staging.
I don't know if it'll be overly complicated at first for that, right? Like we have the way that they're all just sitting in S3, they can just.
Well, it has to be different than the ultimate location.
It does have to be different.
Because the reason why it has to be different is because of the cache timeouts that we set on all of the URLs that match our kind of current standard location for tarballs. Because they can never be changed, we have them with like a very, very long timeout for our CDN, because that, there's around 10,000 packages that account for about 99% of all downloads. So if all of those are stored in memory, obviously then most installs get much, much, much faster.
And should be mindful here that what's being presented here is essentially works much different than versions. So you can stage and overwrite an existing staged version, which is you can't publish over, or you can't have you can't change the published package, right? So the downstream where the actual tarball lives, like is indeed like one of the complexities, I think, for the infra team. So.
So do you see the location on the public internet, not talking about your internal, stuff, changing when it goes from stage to published, or do you see it staying the same?
No, it will have to change.
Well, is that a requirement? That's kind of what I'm asking, right? Because if you change, if I am installing from a staged version, and then the location changes, my lock file is going to change, right? So like I kind of want it to stay the same because it should be the same tarball, right? The point is it shouldn't have changed, been repackaged.
The URL will change. It will still be a cache hit because the integrity won't change.
But that's your internal stuff, right? I'm talking about like my side.
I mean,
when I'm consuming
on your local machine, it will still be a cache hit because the integrity will be the same. So your lock file will get updated. The resolved value will change, but the integrity value will not. And if we happen by some magic to have two tarballs which are exactly identical that you're installing, let's say you install one from the public registry and one from some other registry, but they're the same exact object, Kakash will still read that as a cache hit because the integrity is identical.
Sure, I'd like to prevent the package lock changes though too. Right, if we have a thing and we're staging it, and we try a couple of teams at, like, I'm thinking in like at Netflix, if we have a couple teams and we say, hey, check out the new staged version, and then the next time they go and update their package, their app, they also get a bunch of unrelated to them, seemingly unrelated lock file changes that they have to then go audit, because now it looks like they got a bunch of different packages, even though it's actually just the promoted version that we already got them to beta test.
Well,
right?
I would say, Wes, what you're asking them to do is test something that's in development or in review, and like the stage version shouldn't be considered like it's going to change, right? Like you're going to have to add, in order for somebody to actually install stage versions, you're going to have to add a flag. So my guess is that like the artifact that gets generated is going to be different than when you're pointing at prod type, if you're going to use kind of like those kinds of analogies, right?
I think that there's also more implications for the shrink wraps, namely that because these are essentially now mutable, the integrity could also change if you are publishing a new version. Right, so you will get a new integrity, and so the shrink wrap probably also needs to indicate that, or the log file needs to indicate that this was installed from a stage URL, and that would also mean that the client needs to respect the fact that in this particular case, if it was previously installed from staging, then it should accept the fact that the integrity changed without. I don't know what actually happens when integrity changes for whatever reasons, but I assume there's an error thrown somewhere.
Yes, there ought to be. We have quite a few tests verifying that integrity mismatches do cause an error. So there may be a way to thread this needle. One possible way to do it, and we could dig into this in the spec. I could go have a think on this and kind of come back with some suggestions. But one way that we could do this is basically, if you stage a package, it goes to a URL which is different from kind of the current way that we structure our tarball URLs, but is still somehow permanent, right? So you have imagine, instead of like /foo/hyphen/foo-2.0.0.tgz, it's /foo/hyphen/staged/timestamp/foo.-2.0.tgz. And then when you promote it, we just basically move it into the new location on the pacument. But on our CDN, we can still say like, hey, if anytime you see a URL like this, it's permanent, right?
I mean, the whole point of like the staged versions allowing for you to clobber a staged version is for you to essentially be updating and publishing over top of and when I say publishing to the staged versions over top of that, which means that you can't essentially cache that, or you shouldn't be trying to cache the reference to that artifact, to the tarball, right? So we should be expecting that somebody should be fetching latest, that latest content every
Right,
single
like
time, right? So like
what's the
Yeah,
difference
this is gonna break
between
build stuff.
yeah, so I'm on the same page as Wes. So what's the difference between the URL that points to a staged version and the URL that points to like a regular published version? Because in my mind, they should both be the same, and the registry should just handle it, right? Like if the client's
Well,
asking for a version and it says like I want version 3, and that happens to be a staged version, if you didn't pass along the header that says like I'm getting staged stuff, then the registry should say sorry, this doesn't exist, just like it would if the package version didn't exist, right? Because then your URL never changes, right? It's like a package URL is a package URL is a package URL, right?
hold
like
on. Mike, I think there's some confusion that we're talking about whether we're talking about fetching the package and then getting the URL out of that package, right? Versus being in a lock file where we already have the resolved URL. Because we're not saying in that case like, hey, registry, give me version 2.0. What we're saying is, give me this particular tarball URL, and I expect it to have that integrity.
Sure.
The URLs that we have, if you look in a package in a package manifest in the dist field, the tarball URLs that we have a very sort of specific structure, and any URL that matches that structure in our CDN is basically told cache this forever unless we tell you otherwise. So when we unpublish a version, we just basically purge that one URL out of the cache. And we also send headers that say, this is never going to change. So the issue is, and we may need to just kind of, like I said, just sort of have a think on this and flesh out the RFC. The issue is you have a package lock file that has stored like this, I install a staged version, and then it goes into my lock file. And from the lock file's point of view, it doesn't know that this is a staged version or a thing that came out of a package versus a thing that came out of a URL. It's just like, this is the URL that it resolved to, and this is the integrity that I expect. So then later, when I go to run my installation in CI or something, it just fetches that same URL and gets that same integrity value. Now, if you've told your team, please try out this staged version, right? Okay, so they try out the staged version, it updates their package lock. And then they, sometime later, you do one of two things. You promote that staged version. And what Wes is suggesting is they should be able to run an install and everything keeps working with the same resolved URL and the same integrity value. Second possibility is you've published a new staged version over that same version number, right? So I said, try out our staged version 2.0. They do it. Then sometime later, we make another change to it. We push that new staged version, it overwrites the previous one. At that point, I would suggest that their install should fail if they're installing from a package lock. Or if it doesn't fail, it should at least update, right? So those are two possible cases. If it updates, it's going to be a change to the package lock. And if it fails, it's going to be a 404 because that resolve value now does not resolve to a proper URL that exists.
Right.
And I think we just kind of need to handle both of those cases. If we see that if we try to fetch a URL that is a staged artifact URL, and we get a 404, maybe we could go and re-resolve it and sort of treat that as a whatever, no big deal.
Well, what we're suggesting is that that URL never changes, right?
So,
yeah. So the reason I'm saying that is
sorry, Wes, one sec. Demetrius, I think, raised his hand there. So.
I'm gonna put this I thought out there, but do stage versions have to be mutable? Do they? If you can only basically publish them or unpublish them, promote them or unpublish them, then the mutability issue goes away, and then they can live on a static URL. And then I'm not sure whether staged packages is a good place to use as a trial thing for the team or for other people, as opposed to, say, using disk tags for that.
Right. So you're suggesting basically
nothing will. Yeah.
You're suggesting then that we remove the ability to overwrite a staged version.
Yeah.
So, but there's
in
some
the end,
pretty. Oh, well, I just think there's some usability problems with that. I understand where you're going. I think beta testing with a staged version, maybe we say frowned upon or something. If you have a build in a CI job that shouldn't have happened and you can't override it, and now you're stuck and you can't stage a version ever again, like that's a much worse usability state than the, some team decided, even though we told them not to use this as a delivery mechanism.
They can always publish a new version with new version number, right? So for example, you staged a 2.0.0 and you did not want that to happen. Well, there's never going to be a 2.0.0. There's going to be a 2.0.1. There's nothing in the registry that prevents that happening. And it's also not a problem, other than, it's nice to have numbers go nice and sequential, but it's not a problem in general.
I agree, it's not a problem technically. I think it is a problem for the user experience, right? Like having that be a hard-baked feature of the registry with a, I would call it a flaw, to me is like, I would say almost unacceptable.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm kind of halfway between the two of you here. I think for versions that you've published, you've made available for people to install by default, reusing version numbers is a horrible thing to allow. It was a big mistake. It was a mistake that was very swiftly corrected, really, in the history of the registry. We made them immutable pretty quickly. It really results in some very unfortunate impacts. However, for staging things, it's really useful to have version numbers that match, and people do apply some interesting semantics onto these things. One case that I know folks will be using staged packages pretty regularly is in cases where you have a bundle of projects, a bundle of packages that are kind of all one project, right? So like the folks who are using Lerna, like all of the Lodash modules, all of the Babel modules. The way that they work now is they bump the version of everything and then publish them all at once. So the expectation when you're using anything with Babel is that all of the like @Babel/star are the exact same version number. And it actually applies some really pretty nice ability to like pin dependencies to verify that you're using the things that you tested against and so on. Because of the fact that you can't reuse version numbers, which I think is justifiable for published packages, that means that they basically have to try to publish everything. If anything fails, they have to unpublish everything, bump the version number and everything, and kind of try again. A nice feature of staging is you'd be able to do this in a much more, a much kind of softer way. So you can stage all of your packages. If anything fails, you just fix the ones that failed and publish a new staged copy of just those changes, and then promote everything all at once. And promoting is going to be, a much lower risk type of activity. So, because there's nothing that has to like be uploaded or transferred.
Yeah. So I just want to circle this back because I think we got onto this because Isaac, that there is a heavy dependency here and a blocker to the registry actually supporting all this. And that downstream implementation is where does the package live at rest in staging versus where does it live when it's actually published properly. I think that just making that statement alone kind of says that those two things are different. And I think that will probably be an implementation detail for like the registry team. And how we
Disagree.
cache, or how we like allow you to access that thing, I think is kind of where we should be focusing like the client sort of discussion from, right?
So I agree. The client is where I see the issue. And if the URL changes and your package lock changes, you're going to just cause a ton of churn for people. And I don't think even having those package versions be permanently accessible is the thing, because then you've got somebody who deploys a project because their local developer said, oh, I'm going to try out that new thing. And then like it got shoved in a lock file and they shipped it. And now it's running in production. Like,
But why did they ship something?
Because the people are going to do it. Like, I'm not saying it's the
allowed.
right thing. It's allowed. Yeah. Like they're going to do it. And then I totally understand the URL shouldn't change. Like the contents at the URL needs to stay the same. But I think that if you use the end URL, so if you did, so Isaac put in here the foo with staged in there, right? If you drop the staged, in theory, when they promote it, nothing changes, right? Except the Pacument is now resolving it with the right versions. And so the end consumer, their lock file has the hash in there. It still resolves. It's the same tarball, right?
In the same URL.
Same URL is fine.
Yeah.
Same tarball, fine, because it's just a promote. If it was a overridden version, then the install would fail. It would block their build and it would let them not get to production with a staged tarball that changed, right? So that's actually a benefit if you have the same URL and then swap underneath the version, the tarball, right? Because then your build will break when they try to ship that lock file to production.
Hold on.
And I think
saying,
it matters a lot when you get to the. Okay,
are you
sorry.
saying that basically every staged version of foo at 123 will have the same tarball URL, or we update the tarball URL every time we stage a new version?
They'll have the same tarball URL.
Tarball URL, and the whole point is that the checksum will then fail, which will prevent them from shipping to production a staged version that doesn't match the actual contents that they expected it to be.
That's going to present some technical challenges just for like CDN behavior.
So one sec, I know Dominikus, you had your hand up, but you might be dealing with a dependency there.
What does happen if you have a staged package in your package lock and you run npm install without the staged flag? Is it installed or does it not install?
It'll fail. It should. That should be the behavior, right?
No, I mean, unless we can tell whether or not it's staged from the URL, right? Like, there's no way for it to know, because the whole point of your package lock is it stores the resolved in the integrity field. So it'll just fetch the URL. It won't fetch the package at all.
Yeah, we already have the like dev and optional flags, right, in the metadata. So there'd have to be like a staged flag. Yeah, that's where you're going, I think. Okay.
Right, and if there's a staged flag, because inferring that from the URL, I mean, sure, it would work, but I'd have doubts about such a feature. It would feel like magic. So there's probably going to be a need for a specific flag in the package log to say that it's staged. And if there is such a flag, then you're going to have churn anyways. Then the whole URL debate is yeah.
Well, right. So then what happens? Then that actually breaks the use case where you promote it and you don't want to have to do anything extra, right? Because now the package lock thinks it's staged, even though it's been promoted, without requiring that we make another fetch for the Pacument every time we see a staged flag.
The churn would be that you drop the staged, like that property would leave the package lock. So to that point, Isaac, you're right. There would still be churn, yeah. And
if we're going to have churn anyway, we may as well change the URL. But
this is why I'm saying let's not have churn. Like,
yeah.
Choosing this puts it on every user. If we just keep the same URL, no staged flag, nothing, to promote is transparent to the end consumer, then, and it still might fail if they try to get a new, say they republish and then promote, that would fail the checksum. So it would fail, but it rightfully should. Like,
Well, and the other thing is if we're going to change the checksum, we can also change the URL.
right, at the same time, we could, yeah, that's true.
So we're back to every staged instance has its own unique URL indicating that it's in staging. And every time we stage a new version of it, we...
But the promote is what I'm concerned with, right? So
Yeah,
if
yeah,
those
yeah.
were available at their staged URL and also at the final URL, but then why even do that? Because then just make the final URL, right? Like I don't want to stage something, have one of my consumers that I'm working with closely install it, and then accidentally break or have to churn because I then finally promoted it.
Yeah.
Right. Like
No, I
I want
right.
them to do nothing and me to do everything.
But you do want to break if the integrity, or it's essentially being published over.
So if
integrity
you,
is
right.
now different. Yes.
If you stage a new copy of fluwit123, that's going to break them, and it should, because it's different stuff.
Yep.
It's different bits. So then I guess the question is like, what is the downside? Let's say we get rid of this like fancy staged URL. We just put it at the final URL, and every time we do a new staged version, we purge the CDN cache, which we can do now.
I was going to suggest this earlier. However, there's going to be, I don't know how we handle the difference in time, right? Because purging cache, it's not an instantaneous thing, right? Like we're working with Cloudflare. I don't know what optimizations they've done it, but I know with like Amazon, for instance, it takes like 20 minutes to purge all end nodes, right?
There will be some period of time, and this is something we have a bunch of disclaimers around with unpublishing. Like when you unpublish something, it's not instantaneous, because there are POPs that are going to cache that tarball URL essentially forever. The only really sure way to guarantee that you're going to keep getting a new thing every time we change what the bits are is to bust the cache with a URL that has a unique identifier on it.
It just seems like chunking your JavaScript files, right?
Yeah,
Sure.
so I think this is pretty clearly on the user to understand. Like we'll say this follows normal caching behaviors. Be aware that if you're using this feature, you may receive a cache result, right? And then obviously in most cases that's fine because that's what they want.
Right.
In the case that they are instantly installing after you just change the published version, right, or the staged version, then like that's where you have to know the caveat. But that's going to be a lot less people, and those people are probably going to be writing automation, and they just need to understand that that's a cache.
Yeah.
There's a cache there.
So I guess I'm concerned about that not being as instantaneous as you might expect. So what I'm concerned about is the situation where I stage a version 2.0, I then update it. I say to you, try this version I just staged. You install it, but you actually get the old one because it's still sitting in a cache. Then sometime later I promote it, and now what you're getting is going to be a checksum mismatch, even though the URL didn't change, or even before I promote it, right? At some point the cache expires and you start fetching the new thing at that URL and you get a checksum failure. Now we can put a unique identifier in the URL that just is, the related to that checksum, right? Like, or related to the timestamp, or doing really anything, any arbitrary thing. It doesn't even have to say staged. It could just be some string of numbers. And those people who are in the know would be able to look at the URL and say, oh, I see that there's an arbitrary string of digits here. It must have been staged at some point. I think that there's a way to thread this needle that if we just kind of identify what are the use cases we care about. And I think I'm prepared to say if you install a staged version and then that specific instance gets promoted, it should result in no changes that you can detect in your log file, in your install. Everything should just work. If you stage a new copy with the same version number, then your install must fail like really right away. It should either, and that can be either 404 is the URL and has to refetch it, and causes churn in the lock file, or it gets an invalid checksum, but it has to get that right away. What I don't want to do is have a situation where it's ambiguous what lives at a particular tarball URL, because that is, I've been traumatized in the past with having tarball URLs where the contents change. It results in some really, really awkward, hard to debug things, where, we're like, we've got people calling us saying, it just failed again, but that in 10 minutes it's going to succeed, and it's like impossible to debug realistically. Or it's only failing in Frankfurt, which I don't know why. For some reason, for the longest time, there was like 6 months of my life where just like installs in Frankfurt don't work. Anytime we see the FRA pop, it was just like, Germany is mad at us. And it was never at a convenient time of day, as you can imagine. So that's kind of where I'm coming at this from.
Yeah, I think you make really good points. And but I do think just making sure that the happy path is actually happy for the end consumer, which I think you've already stated commitment to doing that. So that's all that I care about too.
That makes sense.
So just to time box this, because we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm sure there was at least one or two other items folks here wanted to get to. Although I appreciate like how deep we went on this, because I think it does expose like obvious caveats and places that we need to explain how we're going to actually solve for the different scenarios that you're talking about, Wes. We need to essentially make sure that we identify how we're going to resolve those. So I think as a takeaway, Mike, I'm not sure what the notes look like right now because I haven't been following along.
I assigned something to myself, an action to myself.
I literally just posted. It was really hard to try and keep track of notes and critically think about a thing while other people critically think about a thing.
Sure. Appreciate you taking notes though. So yeah, as a takeaway, it sounds like we have to follow up in the PR itself, probably with some of these questions. And it sounds like Dominikus also, you have some peer review feedback that you're gonna give on this guy, on this.
I think it would be great to just sort of the use cases we spoke of. I think it would be great, Wes and Dominikus, if you guys, and even Isaac, just like outline a use case that you want to see. And because I'm just curious to know what, like, I would like this feature because I can do X with it, and like, what does that look like? And if we all said that about it, that's technically our own happy paths. And I'm curious if those all line up, and if they do, is there then some solution that we can create that'll line all those up? And if they all don't line up, I think that's why we're having a little bit like difficulty sort of aligning on this idea of the URL, because I'm not quite sure if all of our happy paths are all exactly the same as each other's. I think it'd be good to have that in the RFC. I think that'd be really, really helpful.
Let's move on then. There's two here. The lifecycle script environment and removing depth from npm update that are both we haven't really chatted about much, and I think they're important.
Which do you want to go first? Because we only have time for one, probably.
Which numbers are this? Sorry.
So the very next one, which is RFC 90, so reduced lifecycle script environment size, which I know there's been a lot of discussion that Isaac, you've been a part of for. Do you want to dive in that or the other one?
Yeah, I can basically just provide a brief update on that.
Yep. And it sounds like potentially we're going to be passing through npm config or npm command as now config. This is kind of where that discussion came.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that need to be set in the environment of the CLI itself. And then when we run the script, there's a couple of package-specific things that are going to be passed through. So rather than just dumping every single thing that's in package.json, we're just going to set the npm package.json environment variable, which is a path to the package.json for that particular file, that particular package running a script. If you want to know it, then you go look there. If you want to know what's in it. It's super easy to parse JSON in JavaScript. And then beyond that, I've added in Arborist already npm package resolved and npm package integrity to the environment. And also npm package optional, npm package dev, and npm package dev optional, which correspond to the flags in the package lock and in the Arborist node objects. So what we're not going to do is pass through every single config value. There's a handful that LJ, Jordan Harban, and a few other folks have brought up as potentially worth submitting, worth including. There was some talk about some ways that the argv environment is being used.
Command, I think, is the most notable that I think is the most helpful, to be honest.
Yeah, so if we just add npm command, and it's already setting the lifecycle script and lifecycle event. So those are, those are kind of the main ones to key on. So yeah, that's implementation is underway, making that happen. Should be fine. The other one, the thing about depth in npm update, this is actually really interesting and might have some more subtle ramifications than people realize. What I ran into with doing update for reify in Arborist is that it's very easy to say, I want to update all packages named foo. It's very challenging to say, I want to update all packages named foo to a depth of 3. The reason being that so once upon a time when npm did not automatically dedupe, depth literally meant how deep in the package tree, how deep in the node modules file system is it. That once we did start deduping, in order to preserve sort of the same kind of behavior, that depth was treated as a logical depth. And this gets really, really convoluted because you can have situations where a package exists at multiple different depths, logical depths, effectively. So, you can imagine if you have one thing that's sort of 10 steps in and one thing that's 1 step in, but they're both deduped to the same thing, like, is that thing a depth of 1 or is it a depth of 10? And what it means is that when we reify the tree, if we have an update with a specified depth, essentially having to do this very awkward walk, and it results in some really weird non-deterministic cases where, if we do update a depth, that can then, if we do update a module at a particular depth, that can change the depth at which another module of that same name is now found, in the case of dependency cycles, right? So previously it only existed at a depth of 10, but then we update something and now that new thing depends on it, and now it's no longer a depth of 10 anymore, it's a depth of 2. So my,
Can I ask, are there any cases where it gets deeper?
Yes, there are. So if you can
because
imagine,
of member ranges, right?
No, because of deduping. So let's say you have a module foo that's depended upon by bar, and I depend on bar. Foo is also depended upon by Baz's 10th level metadepth. I then update, I say I want to update to a depth of 2. So the first thing I try to update is bar. The new version of bar does not depend on foo. So foo's 2-level depth is now been removed, and its new depth is only 10, right? Because you have to be calculating the min version of that. So the only way that I could think to even, and actually what npm 6 is sort of doing, is it's recalculating this repeatedly by rewalking the tree each time to see how deep in something is. And essentially it's like just 1,000 traveling salesman problems. I mean, it's really pretty gross. It gets infinitely more complicated, not infinitely more, it gets significantly more complicated in a world of peer depths because it's not clear how deep a peer depth actually is. If it's been sort of installed automatically by virtue of being a peer depth, right? It's sort of like, it should be either a depth of, n+1 or maybe n because it's at that nth level. That's really, really awkward. So the easiest way to solve this is to just say, let's not use depth for update. If you run npm update, it updates everything.
Yeah.
If you run npm update foo, it updates everything named foo, and that's it.
So just to be mindful of time, we are at time right now. So I'm wondering if I think I agree with what you're saying, but if anybody has any feedback on that proposal, feel free to. There hasn't been any comments since you created the RFC, Isaac, which I'm kind of surprised by. I kind of feel like that's no news is good news. So I feel like
No news means nobody actually understands what is going to be the
either
problem.
doesn't understand it or they all
Doesn't
agree that
use
this
it.
should or doesn't use it. Yeah, that's
Like I don't
yeah.
see why I would personally in any of the workflows I do use depth. So
Yeah.
Sounds
So
like
So
the main way that people use depth is they run --depth equals 9999.
Yeah.
But like the depth arguments that people specify are either 1 or infinity. And I'm like, okay, well, updating to a depth of 1 doesn't make sense. And you probably just, and actually what this does is it means that npm update is the replacement for deleting my package lock JSON and running npm install again.
Yeah. So just want to be mindful again of time to follow up on this conversation.
Oh, okay.
I've got a hard stop, my friend. I'm sorry. But I appreciate everybody jumping on for this call. And again, we do these bi-weekly, so we can carry on the conversation in the PRs themselves or async in the various other channels that we have. But just wanted again to thank everybody for jumping on to the call today. So thank you so much, and I'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.